Vinta Hanan is a bright, sunny yellow that can be too bright for a full page of writing, but may be okay for some small, subtle addition to your notes in some spots. I can read what's there. Now, there's very little noticeable tone shift by paper, but thankfully does offer the tiniest bit of shading, though that may not really matter with this, with as bright a yellow as we have here. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it performed as well as it performed on the premium stuff. For me, I suspect many of you, this is going to be an easy pass just from what you've seen, unless perhaps you want a new highlighter ink. That's really where I think it's going to become most useful.
The pen for today is a Kaweco Sport. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Here's the bright, sunshiny day that is on the Clairfontaine. This is bright, but it is readable. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade. You might have to examine some of the areas a little bit, like examine on the first line where the EX is a little bit darker than the AMI until the INE at the end, it darkens up a little bit. It says that. I know that with it says on the first line and that on the second line. No shading, bright yellow the whole time. It's readable, but it's not the best. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. I'd be surprised if there was.
Vinta makes more than just one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks from Vinta.
Here is Vinta Tala. Here is Vinta Sandugo. Here is Vinta Heritage Brown Panama.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here the tone is just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. I know, hard to tell, but it's so bright. However, it's fully readable. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, doesn't shade. It's readable, which is the thing I have to keep coming back. It is readable. An integer, namely c equals 3, in the situation can also say that 4 divides 12, or I can read all of it without a problem. It's not what I would want a whole page of, but this is not horrible. This is pretty good. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting, though I'd be surprised if we did.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here the tone is almost unreadable as compared to the Clairfontaine. The tone of the paper is really cutting down on what we can do here. I'm going to tell you that from, really looking at it, it's not feathering and it's not spreading. Yes, there are some shading points, but let's be honest, who cares? It's so hard to read with this tone of paper. If you're doing this to yourself, you are a masochist. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, this smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does have a little bit of shading that goes on. The other hand, on the first line, those first 3 words, you see that the H of the is a little bit darker than the T and the E. With other, it's very light with the O, a little darker at the top of the T and the hump of the H, lighter back into the ER. Hand, mid-tone the whole way. I can read this. Strangely, as bright as this is, I would think that it would be cut by the lines of the vertical lines and the horizontal lines on the paper. It's not. It's holding up against it. But it does really disappear with the quad rule. This would not be good to use. It does not work its way past that. Shocker. Looking at the back of the page, another shocker is that it does not bleed and does not ghost.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more yellow inks. Here is Diamine Golden Sands. Here is J. Herban Amber de Bermini. Here is KWZ El Dorado. Here is Sailor Kobe number 21. All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here, the tone is lighter and flatter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread. I know this is hard to tell, but man, oh man, it's there. If I concentrate, I can read it. I can get myself ready to do that when I look at ready on the first line, where the E is ever so slightly darker than the R and the AD, and the Y darkens just a hair. It's barely noticeable, though, and I'm going to say it does not stand out against the quad rule. And if you are a student that uses this to take notes, I am not going to read or correct any of your work. You don't deserve it because you're doing this as punishment. And if you're going to try and reach out and punish me for looking at your work by using this ink, you've got another thing coming. We're going to stop here because I'm going to tell you, when you see students do something like this, it's infuriating. And looking at this, it's infuriating. Looking at the back of the page, I am shocked that it does not bleed or ghost, since it's hard to see on the front of the page.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page. Here is Ackerman, their number 9 Indigo Blue. Here is Diatramentis Poppy Red. Here is Noodler's Aircore Blue Black.
Here is Visconti Sepia.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here, it's just a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now, it might be feathering, it might be spreading. I can't tell. I can't tell if it's feathering or spreading, but I can read it. 13 is not divisible by 2. Thus, there is no integer x for which x, or 2 times x, is equal to 13. Note that we did not say that 13 is odd because I can read it without a problem. Again, this is the kind of thing that maybe if I was adding just a little bit into a note for myself, I might use it. Other than that, not a whole page. I would hand work back and not even look at it if this is how a student did it. But the great news is, looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. If you're using this, you can write on both sides.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The Kaweco Sport has a medium flow, medium nib. And while there is slight tone change by paper, I don't see this as a very useful ink. Not a ton of uses. It's not useless. I just don't see it as hugely useful. Now, to save this, I went for a very wet medium nib. Off camera, I went with the same side, but I wanted to go with very wet and see, did I get it to look better? But it was really unchanged by pen, which means that I'd say use this as a highlighter ink. Really, go for that 6mm Pilot Parallel that we all own so that you can use that as your highlighter and enjoy the heck out of it.